In this module, we're going to examine some of the factors that affect the skeletal muscle's ability to perform and maintain a given level of performance. So we're going to look at the prior physiologic state, so in other words, the training adaptations or lack thereof of muscles undergoing performance, as well as the fatigue that's encountered for contracting skeletal muscles. The central motor drive is responsible for not only motivation, but also pain. In terms of motivation, that's controlled by the limbic system. This is located in the frontal and temporal lobes, which includes the cerebral cortex, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus, and plays a role in emotional behavior and learning. In a series of structures surrounding the brainstem, there are two major neural connections, that of the hypothalamus, which is an indirect effect which controls or exerts its effects through the sympathetic nervous system, and then the motor cortex, which has a direct effect on motor activation. What we want to come away understanding here is that with gross movements, we want higher motivation. So we want the limbic system to really kick in. However, with finer movements, we want less limbic system activation and less motivation. This is all about optimizing performance based on the particular pattern of movement that the athlete is trying to accomplish. Pain is also a factor. Any injuries are going to stimulate inflammation, which results in pain. This is going to affect the gating of receptors. So remember that the GTO can be gated in order to increase force production. Well, with pain, that's actually going to allow the GTO to be very, very sensitive and responsive to any changes in the skeletal muscle. So pain detracts from optimal performance. We also want to take into consideration the prior physiologic state. Glycogen stores make a difference in exercise performance. We know that there's an association between the level of muscle glycogen and exercise performance. Dehydration is also a factor because that's going to affect nerve conduction velocity, it'll affect muscle function, as well as the ability of the human body to dissipate heat. At rest, muscle temperature in the lower extremities is 34 degrees Celsius with a low amount of blood flow. The human body is designed to work optimally at 37 degrees Celsius. The muscle temperature is going to affect nerve conduction velocity, the ability of that muscle to produce force, as well as the enzymatic activity. At 40 degrees Celsius, we actually use up more ATP because there's an uncoupling of oxidative phosphorylation. So the bottom line here is that we want muscle temperature to be at 37 degrees Celsius because that's where we're going to get optimal performance. In practicality, this isn't always possible. In these two diagrams, we're going to compare high and low frequency fatigue. On the y-axis of each of these graphs, we have the amount of force that can be produced as a percent of maximum. On the x-axis, we have the frequency of stimulation in hertz. The red line represents the control state, so before fatiguing the muscle. The blue line represents 1 minute of rest or recovery after fatiguing the muscle. And the green dashed line represents 60 minutes of rest or recovery after fatiguing the muscle. In this research study, an isolated muscle was stimulated to exhaustion at 10 Hertz, that's the graph on the left, and at 80 Hertz, that's the graph on the right. The 10 Hertz graph represents low frequency fatigue, and the 80 Hertz represents the high frequency fatigue. These frequencies are selective for slow motor units and fast motor units respectively. So the low frequency fatigue is selective for slow motor units and the high frequency fatigue is selective for the fast motor units. In the graph on the left, force production at the low frequencies was not recovered even after 1 hour. But force at the highest frequency at 80 Hertz is high even at 1 minute of recovery and is back to normal after 1 hour, indicating that low frequency fatigue is selective for slower motor units and recovery is slow. On the graph on the right, force production after 1 minute at the higher frequencies is very low but recovers by 60 minutes, indicating that the high frequency fatigue affects the fast motor units more and that recovery is rapid. So in summary, when we look at high and low frequency stimulation to fatigue, with high frequency fatigue, that's going to be selective for the fast twitch fibers with a relatively quick recovery. Whereas with low frequency fatigue, this is going to be selective for those slow twitch fibers and recovery is slow and may last up to 24 hours. As an example, think about the last time you went to an amusement park and spent all day doing all the activities that the park had to offer. At the end of the day, you were probably pretty tired. Think about why that is. That's a form of low frequency fatigue, very selective for those slow motor units. So you probably fatigued those motor units and felt completely exhausted. That takes time to recover from, and you need a good night's rest, possibly even a day of recovery. The type of muscle contraction also makes a difference in terms of the amount of fatigue that we'll experience. Even though we are capable of producing more force with eccentric than with isometric or concentric contractions, eccentric contractions are less fatiguing at submaximal levels of force generation. How can we explain this apparent paradox? Let's begin with the simplest principle. Isometric contractions actually produce the fastest time to fatigue because they reduce or completely shut off muscle blood flow. Think of the compression on blood vessels within the muscle during performance of an isometric contraction. Blood flow is completely shut off at surprisingly low percentages of maximum force, somewhere between 40 and 60% of maximum voluntary contraction. The difference among muscles may be related to variance in fiber orientation or fiber type distribution and capillary density. The ischemia caused by an isometric contraction interrupts oxygen delivery, leading to hypoxia and results in a buildup of metabolites that cause decrements in force. Dynamic contractions are less fatiguing because blood flow is not shut off or is interrupted for only a brief time. Submaximal eccentric contractions are less fatiguing than concentric contractions because more force is produced per muscle fiber, so fewer muscle fibers are needed to produce the same amount of absolute force. With eccentric versus concentric contractions, less energy is going to be used and more motor units are held in reserve, available for use as contracting fibers fatigue. Do you remember the hydrogen ion from our metabolism lecture? Where is that hydrogen ion coming from? And what kind of exercise results in greater amounts of hydrogen ion being produced? If you recall, significant lactic acid accumulation occurs during high-intensity exercise, in which non-oxidative metabolism is the primary source of energy production. Lactic acid, as you recall, is labile and breaks down into lactate and hydrogen ion. This hydrogen ion is going to result in a decrease in enzymatic activity like PFK and phosphorylase B to A conversion. Hydrogen ion also inhibits myosin ATPase, and remember that's the enzyme that breaks apart ATP on the myosin filament. So hydrogen ion also displaces calcium from binding to troponin, which means that we'll have less exposure of those active binding sites on the actin filament for myosin to bind to. That's going to decrease force production. The hydrogen ion also interferes with action potential propagation at the neuromuscular junction, as well as having the effect of hyperpolarizing cell membranes. As you might recall, hyperpolarization of a cell membrane means that there's less potassium within the cell. The hydrogen ion also inhibits mobilization of fatty acids from adipose tissue, meaning that we have to rely more now on glycogen stores. Another factor in muscular performance is the work-to-rest cycle, which is based on the intensity of the work, the duration of the work, and the work-to-rest ratio. To examine these factors, let's take a look at a research study that was performed to determine what the optimal work-to-rest ratio would be. In this study, a subject was trying to perform 247 kilojoules, or about 60 calories worth of work, or 412 watts for 30 minutes with the minimal amount of physical stress possible. If the person performed this work continuously, they would have been exhausted just within 3 minutes. In this study, they played around with the exercise to rest ratio. So what you see is a ratio of 1 to 2 on the graph. On the y-axis in this graph, we have blood lactic acid, which is a good indicator of fatigue. On the x-axis, we have 30 minutes of time for the overall exercise and rest periods. All these scenarios that are graphed here represent a 1 to 2 exercise to rest ratio. In the top line, there was 60 seconds of work followed by 120 seconds of rest. And this was intermittent over the course of 24 minutes. So in the top line, this person fatigued at just 24 minutes and couldn't complete all of the work. If we reduce the amount of exercise to 30 seconds, interspersed with 60 seconds of rest, so we alternated 30 and 60, the person was able to complete all their work and was less fatigued. If we further reduce the amount of work to just 10 seconds of exercise and 20 seconds of rest, so alternating that over the course of 30 minutes, the person really wasn't all that fatigued and also completed their work. While it's unrealistic to work for only 10 seconds and rest for 20 seconds in a real-life situation, it's the principle here that's important. The critical factor in the completion of work with the least amount of stress is the length of the work period. The duration of the rest periods and the total time spent are of secondary importance. In fact, in this particular study, the exercise to rest ratio was increased to 1 to 4. So the person performed 60 seconds of exercise with 240 seconds of rest. there was actually no benefit in terms of fatigue by doing this. So increasing the amount of rest had very, very little effect on the fatigability of the overall work performed. But it lengthened the amount of time that it took to complete the work. So that's not beneficial as well.